Welcome to this session of our conference for the spring on the challenge of immigration, inviting a new American conversation, to be held here at Yale Divinity School. This conference is being made possible by the generosity of Andrew Sorensen and the Lectureship and Conference Fund, which he endowed in honor of his mother, Margaret Lindquist Sorensen. President Sorensen from the University of South Carolina is here. Please, if you'd stand. A divisive national debate is currently raging in the United States over immigration. The debate is primarily focused on two concerns: border security and the determination of the future for an estimated 12 million undocumented workers accused of illegal entry and currently residing in the U.S. It is clear, however, that this cannot simply be considered as a domestic political issue. Immigration into the U.S. is part of a much larger global landscape in which 200 million people worldwide are engaged in various forms of migration. Therefore, we ask this afternoon, how does a global framing of the U.S. immigration debate change our conversation? To lead us in the exploration of this question, we have three eminent colleagues, each with a different academic background as well as personal experience that ranges broadly over the academic and political spectrum. To lead our conversation, we're delighted to welcome back to Yale Divinity School a distinguished alumnus of the school, George Rupp. Rumor has it that his last public address in this facility was as a student in 1968. George Rupp has been president of the International Rescue Committee since July 2002. As such, he oversees IRC's relief and rehabilitation operations in 25 countries and its refugee settlement and assistance programs throughout the U.S. He is the author of numerous articles and 5 books, including Globalization Challenged, Commitment, Conflict, and Community, published in 2006. Before joining the IRC, George Rupp was president of Columbia University and prior to that, president of Rice University, after he had served as John Lord O'Brien Professor of Divinity and Dean at Harvard Divinity School. Born in New Jersey of immigrant parents, George has studied and conducted research for extended periods in both Europe and Asia. He was awarded an A.B. from Princeton in 1964, a B.D. from our august institution in 1967, and a Ph.D. from that other institution up in Cambridge in 1972. Bill Hing is a professor of law at the University of California, Davis. He teaches immigration policy, judicial process, negotiations, public service strategies, and Asian American history, and directs the law school clinical program. He's the author of numerous academic and practice-oriented books and articles on immigration policy and race relations. Among them are Deporting Our Souls, Values, Morality, and Immigration Policy, Cambridge, 2006, and Defining America Through Immigration Policy, Temple, 2004. Dr. Hing is the founder of and continues to volunteer as general counsel for the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco. And he's on the board of advisors of the Asian Law Caucus and also serves on the National Advisory Council of the Asian American Justice Center. Rima Salah of Jordan is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations Mission in the Central African Republic of Chad, and delayed her departure for Chad to be with us here today. Previously, she was Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, where she had a distinguished 20-year career. Prior to joining UNICEF, she was a lecturer at the State University of New York in Binghamton, and Dr. Salah has been awarded several honors for her work, including the government of Vietnam's highest honor, the Medal for the Protection and Care of Children, as well as the Chevalier de l'Ordre National from the government of Burkina Faso. She holds a Ph.D. in cultural anthropology and a master's degree in education and sociology from the State University of New York. She earned her bachelor's degree in sociology and social work from the Beirut College for Women in Lebanon. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished presenter and our respondents for this afternoon's panel. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Harry, for that gracious introduction. I won't go into your chronology, but it deconstructs itself because you said I gave a speech here as a student in '68 and then indicated I graduated in '67, which only one of those facts is right, and it's the second of them. I'm glad to add my word of welcome to all of you. It's May Day. As we know, there are demonstrations going on across the country in support of immigration, so it was really very far-sighted of the Yale Divinity School to launch this panel on this day. Acting as Harry's deputy, John Lindner indicated to me that he thought there had been some frustration on these occasions in the past because there hadn't been enough time for discussion. So I have provided a written version of what I might have said orally if I spoke as long as the written version is. And the written version is in your packet. I hope you enjoy referring back to it and meditating on it thoughtfully. But I will try to be briefer than that so that we have time for discussion. I look forward very much to our conversation. First, Rima Salah's and Bill Hing's responses, and then questions and comments from all of you. As Harry indicated, he and John and the other planners of this conference thought it would be helpful to place immigration in the context of globalization so that we would be able to have the hope of more light and less heat on this very conflicted topic if it's looked at just within the American political context. And by placing it in the context of globalization, global migration becomes one instance of the very rapid movement of all kinds of entities and commodities across borders. I agreed I would give that assignment a go, and the written version of what my reflections came up with is in your packet. I'll give you an overview with a few of the illustrations that are in there, but I will try to do it briefly enough so that we have some time for discussion. We all read about globalization, and so we know there is an increasingly rapid and intense movement of money, of goods and services, of ideas across what used to be fairly impervious international boundaries. But the movement of money and goods and services and ideas is relatively simple compared to the movement of people. But as Harry has just indicated, there are hundreds of millions of people who are also on the move, and they come from all kinds of directions and for all kinds of motivations. And it is incumbent on us, if we want to have a conversation about immigration in this country, to try to get some understanding of at least some of what motivates those people on the move. I, in this paper, decided to look at it from the angle of vision that I know the best, namely the movement of refugees and other uprooted populations. There are 35 million such people around the world. That's an abstraction. Think of it more concretely. The populations of Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, New York, and New Haven we can throw in. All put together, and we still haven't quite gotten to 35 million people. That's the number of refugees around the world. It's a very important subset of global migration. It figures very prominently in our sense of displacement around the world. Think of images of throngs of people fleeing violence, clutching all that they own, or at least all that they could take with them, or long lines of supplicants waiting for water, for food, for shelter, for registration papers, or, to put on the positive side, family circles, friends and acquaintances rejoicing when they have a chance to get back together after being separated. The organization that I work with, the International Rescue Committee, has this subpopulation of global migration as the focus of our attention. The International Rescue Committee was founded in 1933, as we're fond of telling anyone who asks, at the suggestion of Albert Einstein, who thought it would be good to have a committee of notables located in New York, working with counterpart committees in various cities, including in particular in our case Marseille, from which refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe were able to escape and then work with them from the time of their escape or rescue of them until they could be resettled in this country. We continue to do that. The first resettlement office was in New York. We now have 24 resettlement offices around the country. It's exhilarating work. We do it with a raft of our own staff, but then also many more volunteers who work with them. It is very exciting. And when in normal circumstances, that is to say before 9/11, we resettled about 10,000 refugees each year through this network of resettlement offices. Most of our employees in the resettlement offices are themselves refugees, so they know the drill of tough love to get people back on their feet quickly. Those who don't know English learn English, kids get into school, parents find jobs, and almost without exception, within 6 months, at most a year, they're really on their feet taking care of themselves. And we've watched these refugees now over the 75 years in being involved in this work, and they almost without exception become very productive citizens of this country and people who've really made a difference for the good in our society. But the numbers tell the story. Even if we get back to the pre-9/11 levels of 70,000 refugees admitted a year, that means 70,000 out of 35 million uprooted people in the world. Or to put it more sharply, 2 out of every 1,000 refugees in the world have any prospect of being resettled in the United States. Or to put it the other way around, 998 out of every 1,000 need to find another way of getting back on their feet in another place other than the U.S. And that's why the International Rescue Committee now is a major international organization with programs in 25 countries around the world, and that's where most of our work goes on. To give a little texture to the very general comment about refugees and the role they play in global migration, I'm resisting the temptation to talk about all of the countries where we're involved, but I thought one example might be useful just to see the multiple ways in which this particular flow of people on the move has an impact directly on us in some cases, indirectly in very profound other ways. So the example I thought I would use is Afghanistan. It really demonstrates all of the issues and shows the way in which an organization like the International Rescue Committee works on all sides of this debate. First, on the resettlement question, over the last 28 years, we have resettled about 7,000 Afghan refugees in this country. And if you go to an Afghan restaurant anywhere, or if you go to see anything else that is ethnically Afghan, almost certainly some of these refugees are the people who came here and have since really integrated their traditions and become full-fledged Americans. But 7,000 refugees. At the height of the refugee crisis for people leaving Afghanistan, there were over 6 million refugees in Iran and Pakistan. And so the International Rescue Committee has also worked with them. In particular, we've worked in Pakistan for all of the years since large refugee flows left Afghanistan, that is to say, beginning with the Soviet invasion in 1980. There are many wonderful stories about the way in which those Afghan refugees have gotten back on their feet. I'll just tell you one project that we have that is my favorite school in all of our networks of schools around the world. It's in Peshawar, Pakistan. We have been educating. It was founded to educate girls. The education was such an opportunity for Afghan refugees that they prevailed on us to allow boys, at least up to 4th grade, also to be in the school. And for 28 years, it's been educating mostly girls, a few young boys, many of whom now have gone back to Afghanistan and are the human capital that makes it possible to have schools established for girls in Pakistan. The curriculum that we developed in this school over those 28 years has now been accepted by the Afghan Ministry of Education as the standard Dari curriculum for all Afghan schools. And this is an example of the way in which Their having made good use of their time and while they were refugees allows them really to be in a position to make substantial contributions when they go back. We've also been involved, not quite for 28 years, but for about 20 years in Afghanistan itself. So all through the time of the Taliban, we were active in helping returning refugees and also displaced people within Afghanistan get back on their feet. And here, to stay with the theme of education, here too we educated girls. We did it even during the years of the Taliban. We did it quietly. We didn't make a big scene about it. It was in small settings, in homes. And the Taliban allowed it because the parents insisted on it. They wanted their girls as well as their boys to become educated. Afghanistan is in a very exciting place. We read about it every day. It's not at all clear it's going to be able to see its way through the challenges that it currently has. But we're very excited to be working there, and we're working to build capacity at the most local level. As I gave you one example of a project in Pakistan, let me give you one example of a project, but although a very diverse project, in Afghanistan. It's called the National Solidarity Program. It's funded mostly by the World Bank, and it's a program that allows the development projects at the most decentralized level to take place. So we work in over 1,000 villages in Afghanistan. We always start the same way. We have a local village council established, and that council determines what their highest priorities are for projects, and those are then funded through the Ministry of Rural Development so that those resources can be used. It's a program that I'm very fond of because we have two very interesting connections to it. First of all, the Minister of Rural Development, whose brainchild this project was, had been the head of our Afghan programs before he went into Hamid Karzai's cabinet. He knew about a program just like this that the IRC had conducted in Rwanda. So we had a team of Rwandans, not international staff, Rwandan staff, come to Afghanistan to train the Afghans who have been implementing this program. We now have in Afghanistan 750 staff. 7 of them are non-Afghans. All the rest are people whom we've trained, who we've brought along, and who are working in programs like the National Solidarity Program. Well, that's a kind of sense of the way in which we work with refugees, both in the places they fled to and places where they might be resettled, in particular in the U.S., or when they go back home once it's safe to go back home. Although in Afghanistan it's probably a little early to say it's safe to go back home, but all but a small fraction of Afghan refugees have in fact returned home in spite of the dangers that remain. I'll be glad to amplify any of those points. You can read more detail in the paper that you have. And I'd certainly be happy to discuss any of those points with Bill and Rima or respond to any questions that you have. But my hunch is if our discussion focuses on any of the issues I've raised in that paper, it will focus for the most part on the lessons that I propose we all need to learn about this whole complex set of issues. And there are two kinds of lessons that I identify. One is lessons for the way in which we interact with the sending countries, the countries whose citizens or whose the members of whom are the refugees that are fleeing across borders, and then a series of lessons also for the receiving countries like the United States. So first, lessons that concerned sending countries. First one is important for organizations like the IRC, but for any other organizations or individuals that want to work internationally in these countries in which large numbers of refugees are generated. That's means for the most part countries that are in conflict, that have generated tensions enough to make people leave their homes. And this first lesson is that we must, from the very beginning of our intervention in those countries, focus on building capacity of the local communities rather than allowing or encouraging, without meaning to, a kind of dependence on international assistance. Now, that's easy to say in theory. It is terrifically difficult to implement in practice. The example I use in the paper is Sudan, or in particular Darfur, but you could use any one of the other examples. If someone is dying from easily preventable diseases because of a conflict and dislocation based on the conflict, what's needed is rehydration therapy and other means to keep people from dying of diarrhea, malnutrition, and the rest. Not a theory about how in the long run, now you make sure you take care of yourself, young man or young woman. But in spite of the difficulty, it is absolutely crucial that we focus from the very beginning on building capacity rather than allowing the kind of dependency that can develop from long-term residence in either refugee camps or other settlements where people are completely dependent on the international community. So that's one lesson. It's not one that immediately affects us, but it's important that we learn it. The second is one that we Americans really do have to make sure we learn. It is that communities at all levels, up to and including government, are crucial if humans are going to flourish. I spend a lot of time in what most people would call failed states. And so I have a vivid sense of how important having some minimum level of governance is important. But let me just talk for a few minutes about the Democratic Republic of Congo as a concrete example, as in a sense the poster child of what happens if you have horrifically bad governance over a long period of time. DRC was burdened with having King Leopold II, a kind of voracious colonial occupier, followed by an equally voracious and corrupt first-generation independence leader, Mobutu Sese Seko. And then when it seemed to be finally digging out from under that, was hit with insurgents from Rwanda after the Rwandan genocide, and has been in more or less uninterrupted war since 1994. The International Rescue Committee has done, the reason this example is one that's compelling is we have done very careful, this is a macabre term, surveys of excess mortality in Congo, which takes a we worked with the Center for Disease Control and other first-rate academic institutions. I don't think anyone questions the findings, even though they're horrific, but what we try to do is measure the level of deaths above what would be a baseline that be expected in this case, Central Africa. And I won't bore you with all the details, but the bottom line is that excess mortality in Congo from this war, the latest fighting, the post-Rwandan fighting, is over 5 million people. Excess mortality, over 5 million people, and most of us in this country don't even know, haven't known that there is a major war going on. It's the single largest death toll of any war since World War II, by far the largest death toll of any war ever in Africa. And 95% or more of those fatalities are civilians, not military. And there's casualties that result from the aftermath of war, including the uprooting of population and the lack of basic infrastructure, health care, and the rest. That's the horrifically bad news. The better news is that our surveys, we've done a series of 5 of them, show that the rate of mortality is tapering off, it is declining, just because of the modicum of stability from having UN peacekeepers, access from humanitarian actors, the beginnings of restoring stability. So Congo is an example where if anyone needs to be shown that having too little government is at least as dangerous as having too much government, take a careful look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. So second lesson, governance at all levels, from the community up to the state, are crucial if there's going to be any chance for communities to flourish. Third lesson is, again, straightforward, has to do with sending and receiving countries, but I'm focusing now on the receiving one, on the sending ones. Catastrophe prevention is far preferable to emergency intervention. That means we have to make investments in security, in trade that benefits the poor as well as the rich, and in foreign assistance to a much greater degree than we have been prepared to do. Because the alternative is, first of all, endless wars of the sort that Congo illustrates. Secondly, increasingly large numbers of refugees and other global migrants who come from areas that simply cannot support or sustain them. So this, again, is a lesson especially important for the United States. We need to do closer to our fair share in terms, in particular, of foreign assistance. And if you need convincing that we don't do our fair share, the data are in the section of the book with the section of that paper with the title "Catastrophe Prevention is Preferable to Emergency Intervention." I'd be glad to give you as much in the way of data as you want. My dear spouse tells me most people don't like numbers as well as I do, so I'll resist doing that at the moment. So those are three lessons that we have to learn if we're from the perspective of the sending countries. First, that building capacity at the local level is absolutely critical. Second, that building stable governance is also crucial. And finally, that we need to do more in terms of assistance, especially in education, healthcare, and basic sanitation than we have done in the past. Three quick lessons for receiving countries, countries like us, and I think here we will have the good fortune that we will hear a good bit more from Bill and from, well, maybe from Bill more than from Rima, but we'll see. The first lesson is that we simply have to fix U.S. immigration policies and procedures so that they aren't just an endless exercise in frustration that thwarts the very purposes of having an immigration system at all. There are endless examples. Let me just give you two that are very topical right now. In the change in the U.S. Patriot Act and the Real ID Act after 9/11, there were legal requirements introduced that included a criterion of what is called providing material support as grounds for not admitting refugees. Turns out providing material support excludes many people. Cuban refugees, for example, would be any of them that in any way resisted the Castro government would not be under this rule allowed to settle. But to take contemporary examples, a woman in Liberia captured by rebels during the fighting with John Taylor, whose father was killed, who was raped, who was forced to cook and clean for the rebels who occupied the family home, was disallowed from immigration because she had provided material support to an armed group. Or the Karen refugees from Burma who flee into Thailand and in any way were associated with those Karen forces opposing the Burmese government, which of course the U.S. is on record for a long time as opposing, were not allowed to be admitted. Now that one we managed to get a waiver, has to go all the way to the Secretary of State to get a waiver to allow that particular subgroup of the population, but it has been a very serious problem. Or Colombians who resisted, who had family members taken, kidnapped by rebels, and paid ransom to have their family members released. If that's in any way evident in any of their records, they're excluded from being admitted. This is becoming even worse because now those same provisions are being used when people apply to change their status. So perfectly good legal American immigrants who've been here for 6 or 7 or more years, when they apply for citizenship, if it turns out that they violated one of these regulations, Cubans again, for example, they can be deported, and they have been arrested pending deportation, except for legal actions taken. So, first lesson is we have to fix. I said I'd give you 2 examples. A very current example: Iraqi refugees, Iraqis who worked with the U.S. as interpreters and in other ways, with not necessarily with the military, with contractors and with others, are simply prevented in massive numbers from getting into this country for a whole variety of reasons, which we could discuss at length. Okay, first lesson, we've got to fix our immigration, both policies and the procedures through which they're implemented. Second lesson is that we need to welcome connections between immigrant populations and the countries that they came from. That is a matter that enriches our country, but also in an era of global movement of peoples is critically important if we're going to have a United States that is not more isolated from the rest of the world than it needs to be. There are $300 billion of remittances that these hardworking immigrants in this country and other developed countries send back to their home countries. $300 billion. That's more than triple the total of all the foreign assistance from all the developed world. From very poor people who are connected to their home communities and in effect are providing foreign assistance far in excess of anything that the rich world is providing. We need to encourage those sorts of connections. And finally, we should develop a culture of inclusion in this country that is adequate to a time of global migration. We have historically had a culture of inclusion. We have very seriously moved away from that in recent years. And any of us who have read and admired Bill, your books know perfectly well how vivid the examples can be of the ways in which we have become very different from our own roots, and that we have to reverse. As you'll see if you look at the paper in discussing this last lesson, the challenge of developing a culture of inclusion, I refer to my family. My wife, Nancy, finds it embarrassing to have references that are so personal. So I'm going to embarrass her further because she's here. And she's going to stand up so you can see who she is. And actually, our daughter is also here with her 3 kids. And if you read that section, you will see that she's the one who insisted that, who learned German when she was a kid, who insisted that her children learn German, who has also taught her son German and Japanese. But I mention our family because it's I think, an arresting story. Our family Nancy's family goes back to the Mayflower on both sides. So she's those of you who were in the earlier session where we had all of the demographic data about the changing population, well, she's, clearly in that WASP tradition that goes all the way back that now is, less than a third of the population. My parents were both immigrants, and so as I am fond of telling Nancy, I saved you from terminal inbreeding. But what's even more interesting is in the next generation. Now, Nancy, all the way back to the Mayflower, her father moved to Pennsylvania. That's a big step from New Hampshire, which was where they lived. And so of the kids in that family, our children, 2 girls, married the son of Italian immigrants and the son of, well, not even the son of, a Singaporean Chinese man. The other kids in the family, the other leg of the family from Nancy's family had 2 children. One married a Puerto Rican, and the other married an Indian. So here in one generation you have from after several hundred years of undiluted WASP culture in very small sub-chunks of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, all of a sudden a family that's spread out over the whole world. Now, what's interesting about our particular family is that they maintain connections. So the Singaporean connection includes, parents who live in Singapore, family who lives in Singapore, property in Singapore, possibility of going there and living in Singapore, or at least warding off job offers to go back to Singapore. The Puerto Rican-American combination includes bilocation in Florida and in Puerto Rico and movement back and forth. The Indian, they just had their first child, but I have no doubt that just as the Singaporean family are learning English as well as Chinese as well as English, and our kids learn German and Japanese as well as English, this child will learn Hindi as well as English. And I mention that just because I think it's a microcosm of what increasingly is going to happen. And as we talk about religion and a new religious conversation or a new American conversation with religion playing an important role, and the way in which what we're experiencing is the de-Europeanization of Christianity in this country. We're also experiencing the same kind of pluralization within individual families. And I expect I'm not the only one where that's the case. I mention that personal set of examples because I hope others of you, when we have a chance for discussion, will also comment about your personal stories. But first we're going to hear from Bill and Rima, and I'm not sure which order.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Dear friends, it gives me great pleasure and honor to be with you. And I want to thank the Yale Divinity School and in particular Dr. John Linder for inviting me, and to thank the school for all what you do to advance humanity. Indeed, the global framing of the United States immigration debate will help to change the conversation. The effectiveness of our policies and our actions depend on our ability to understand the broader patterns of people on the move in today's world. We call the 21st century the century of movement or the century of displacement. In my response to Dr. George Rupp, I will talk about international migration, its connection to human rights and sustainable human development. I will also tackle issues concerning refugees and displaced people. International migration, as you've heard, flows have increased substantially over the past decades. Around 3% of the world's population resides in a country other than where they were born. The number has more than doubled since 1975, with 56 million living in Europe, 50 million living in Asia, and 41 million living in North America. Consequently, international migration is the subject now of unprecedented attention at the United Nations and among the nations in general, governments, and particularly civil society. For many years, as you know, member states of the United Nations found it hard to discuss the sensitive issues of migration in the international arena. So the topic was never high on the UN agenda until the high-level dialogue that took place at the United Nations headquarters in New York in 2006. Since then, our Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, established a global forum on migration and development. In his inaugural session that took place in Brussels in July 2007, the Secretary General said, and I quote, "We must make the most of this chance to address one of the great global challenges of our century. We must seize the moment to begin transforming what too many perceive as a threat into an opportunity. It is our obligation to understand the implications of the migration phenomenon, to learn from each other, and to build partnerships that will make migration work for development." Yes, migration, as we've heard, has the potential to deliver many benefits for development and poverty reduction, and particularly to contribute to the Millennium Development Goals. And you all know that all states in the world have adhered to the Millennium Development Goals, which is to reduce poverty, to reduce maternal mortality, to reduce also mortality of children, to increase education. So all nations have adhered to the Millennium Development Goals. And this was reinforced 2 years ago when all head of states came to the United Nations and signed that they will achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So in this increasingly globalized and integrated world, the move abroad, as we've heard, is economically beneficial, for example, for most migrant workers and their families. We've heard that remittances to labor exporting countries represent a key source of foreign exchange and can improve the livelihood of recipient families and communities. Also, migrant communities overseas can be important sources of expertise and support, and returning migrants can bring new knowledge and skills. However, migration can pose a number of challenges to migrants and their families. These can include risks to the healthy mental and physical development of children, or increases on the workload of women and children left behind in the countries of origin. In labor-sending countries, a growing number of children are left behind by one or both parents. For example, since 2000, more than 300,000 children and adolescents have been left by one or both parents in Ecuador. Data from Moldova and El Salvador, from Jamaica and Albania show similar trends. While migration is moving up the global development agenda, its wide-ranging implications for children and adolescents have received little attention so far. Migration problems affecting children and youth must be seen in the broader context of widespread poverty and conflict, in the global as well as the local context, and against the perspectives of vulnerability, for example, gender relations and the rights of children and adolescents. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we call the CRC, which was ratified by all countries in the world except two countries, and I know who are the two countries, maybe you know, Somalia and the United States, but we hope that you will press your government to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the states have obligations to adopt principles stipulated in the Convention towards each and every child within their jurisdiction. These principles include the right to a nationality, which is very important, to physical integrity, to health and education, and the right to be free from discrimination and exploitation. Nonetheless, studies undertaken by UNICEF in some countries suggest that children and adolescents left behind may be at greater risk to drug abuse, to psychosocial problems, and violent behavior. Moreover, children of migrants may face challenges in adapting to host societies and sometimes are in danger of social exclusion and are at a greater risk of dropping out of school and have difficult access to social services. Hence, children and adolescents affected by migration are particularly vulnerable and should receive special protection. And I like the word protection, which is being used now, human security, social protection by the United Nations and all stakeholders, and also by His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI in his recent visit to the USA. He talked about migrants and he asked for their protection. And why is this important? Because we are in this school and in this chapel, and I cannot tell you enough about the role of religious leaders, the role of religion faith societies, for example, that can play in empowering the migrants all over the world. And he talked about, and he incited all religious leaders from their pulpits, in the church, in the mosque, wherever they are, to help migrants and the most vulnerable. Also, the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, said, "It is our duty to counter the marginalization, abuse, and discrimination that some groups of migrants face today. It is our calling to move forward together and with courage. End of quotation. So UN agencies such as UNICEF, UNDP, and ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, are accompanying governments and other stakeholders to develop policies and program intervention to maximize the benefits of migration, limiting its negative effect on children and their families. For example, Ecuador, in Moldova, in Mexico, the Philippines, among others, are making efforts to deal with some of migrants' risks and increase the positive impact. What we all should do, and it's so important. Of course, I talked about governments, I talked about the United Nations, but as we know, and we heard from Dr. George Rupp about the importance of non-governmental organizations and civil society. So all together, we should continue to advocate for an approach to migration and development that effectively addresses protection and human rights. We should also insist that children and their families must matter in migration policies. We should all work together to monitor and gather information. That is why are children not visible? Because we don't have enough information. So we should all gather information on the well-being of children and their families in migrant communities. Also, we should promote awareness in sending and in host societies so that the risks of discrimination and social exclusion are reduced. But dear friends, the complexity of today's displacement goes well beyond voluntary migration. We see more and more people forced to move because of extreme deprivations, because of war and conflicts, and because of persecution. The number of refugees, as we heard, and displaced people rose to more than 34 million. Millions of children are growing up in families and communities torn apart by armed conflict and war. I will never forget the child that I met in northern Uganda. And he said, "Madam, you should stop the war because I was born and the war was there. The war has grandchildren now." Allow me to tell you about my own experience. I was born a refugee. While growing up, I remember asking my parents, what is a refugee? Why are we refugees? As a young child, it was difficult to understand why we were different and what could be done to be part of normal life again. Later, when I grew up, I lived in a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan to conduct research for my doctoral thesis. I witnessed the terrible effects that war has on people's lives. I also learned that despite all of the indicators that we have in social science, there are no indicators to capture the full extent of people's pain, suffering, loss, and sadness. There are also no indicators also to monitor resilience, moral courage, and wisdom. My work for UNICEF took me to some of the poorest countries of the world, such as Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo, Vietnam. These countries are crippled by political instability and conflict, not Vietnam, but the other countries in Africa. I will never forget the vivid images I have of families and little children fleeing Monrovia on August 2003 with all their belongings wrapped in bundles on their head. I also met Maimouna in one of the camps in Mali in 2002 after her shanty town in the Ivory Coast, which is a country in West Africa, was burned and was bulldozed to the ground. She said, "My husband and I saved what we could. There wasn't much time. Men were beaten and some women were raped. I don't want to go back. I'm too scared, and so are my children. We only have what is here on these sacks," she said. "The rest has been stolen, burned, or destroyed. We've got to start our lives all over again due to the war, and we need to find jobs, and our children need to go to school. The United Nations and its partners, all the non-governmental organizations, we work together to improve life in the camps, delivering health, education, and protection services. I think we heard how important is education. That's why we have started what we call back-to-school campaigns in many countries, such as Liberia, where more than 1 million children went back to school, in Congo, in Afghanistan, and many of other countries. And we saw how important is education. Even when there is war and conflict, education is important because it gives a sense of hope to children and their families. So, however, when one visits a camp in West Africa, in Lebanon, in Sudan, or in Eastern Chad, it is clear that we must go beyond a commitment to improve life in the camps. As Mr. Antonio Guterres, who's the High Commissioner for Refugees, said, it is our duty to redo our efforts or to redouble our efforts and create conditions that will offer real hope for an end to both the refugee situation and the camp themselves. We must persist, even if we know the solutions are most often not humanitarian but political. Without political engagement, refugees will never see an end to their plight. And when I say about political engagement, it is all over and all countries. Last year, for example, there are some achievements, and we heard them. Last year, for example, almost 1 million refugees were repatriated voluntarily. They went back home. In 2007, 500,000 refugees have gone back home to Afghanistan, to Southern Sudan, to Burundi, and to Congo. All this with the assistance of the UN, with the non-governmental organizations. But despite those achievements, we must acknowledge that the only effective way to protect children and their families during war and conflict is to protect them from conflict and war. We know that the cycle of disparities, poverty, and marginalization at global, national, and regional level is the central cause of most conflicts in the world. So we need to intensify our efforts to promote social justice and the respect of human rights in times of peace and in times of war. Most importantly, we need to remind all our political leaders, all the political leaders all over the world, of their responsibility to adopt a peaceful means of conflict resolution. And we can do it together. We all can do it together. The United Nations, the non-governmental organizations, the religious leaders, civil society. We have to have our voice heard everywhere, because the plight of refugees, the plight of displaced people has to stop. Thank you very much.
I want to tell you how humbled I am being up here following George Rupp and Rima, Salah, because I so admire the work that they engage in every day, their hands-on efforts and successes at affecting the lives of so many individuals and human beings across the world. There was a time, I suppose, when I could make that claim when I was a legal aid attorney, but now as an academic, I mostly describe and talk to people and try to get their voices heard. I want to thank the school for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to particularly thank John Linder for all the efforts that he made, and Emily for all the efforts that she made. John was so conscientious, he gave me a call late last night to make sure that I had a ride from the airport, so I was very impressed by that. Thank you. On a different September 11th, the one in 1998, it was a Friday. There were 2 bodies that were discovered dead along the U.S.-Mexico border. 2 migrants that were attempting to come across at a time when it was still pretty hot, actually. And then the next day, Saturday, there were 3 more bodies that were found in the American Canal, the body of water that separated the border of California and Mexico. And then on Sunday, there was another body found in the desert. And the people that he had traveled with left him there and moved on, but the body was found by the Border Patrol. So all in all, there were 6, 7 bodies that were found that September 11th weekend in 1998. And we did not hear any moral outrage about those bodies in September 11th, 1998. Of course, in September 11th, 2001, there was tremendous outrage, and it was a tragedy, of course, and you could say, well, it was a difference in scale. 3,000 people that were killed on September 11th, 2001. But in fact, if you look at the history of the border, the recent history of the border, since the implementation of what has come to be known as Operation Gatekeeper and other methods of militarizing the border, there's been well over 3,000 people that have died of the same kinds of causes because of an enforcement policy that we have consciously engaged in this country, that we, all of us sitting in this room, at least those of us who are citizens, have endorsed, because we've elected those leaders that have implemented those policies, and those deaths, I believe, are our responsibility. And we've continued to implement that policy, even though we know that deaths will continue on an average of 1 per day at the border, because we've implemented a policy that pushes people to cross that border at the most dangerous places. And it's got to make us wonder about immigration policy when not only do we condone that, but we prosecute 2 volunteer college students who worked the summer of 2005 in the Arizona desert for an organization called No More Deaths, Shanti Sells and David Strauss. I believe both of them were from the northeast part of the United States, and they volunteered for the organization, and what they did was they roamed the desert in the summer of 2005 when there were 35 consecutive days of over 100-degree weather. It was a cool summer. And they roamed the desert looking for migrants that were trying to cross. And the organization was the Border Patrol was fully aware of No More Deaths. In fact, they had regular conversations about what they did. And the volunteers were under strict orders to not pick up any of the migrants because it could be a violation of law to illegally transport individuals if you were trying to help them cross. The only time they could pick up, so often what they generally did was they handed water to them, they gave them directions. Some people foolishly were crossing with a single bottle of water and tennis shoes, and not knowing what they were up against, and so many times the individuals wanted to turn back, and so the volunteers pointed, if they could, in the direction that they should go back, and often the migrants wanted to turn themselves in, and that's when they would be transported by No More Deaths to the Border Patrol. And so the only time that they could deviate from that was if they thought the individuals may be dying. Then they were under even more strict instructions to call on-call medical personnel to describe the body conditions of the individuals. And so on this particular day, David and Shanti came across two people that looked near death. And they still had vital signs. They gave them water. They still could not revive them. They called the medical personnel. The medical personnel said, "You've got to get them in, otherwise they're going to die." So they put him in the van that said no more deaths. It was very clearly marked. They drove past the Border Patrol station, not trying to hide. They took them to the emergency room, and their lives were saved. And a few days later, those individual migrants were sent back to Mexico. No surprise. But what was surprising was that a month later, a federal indictment was issued against Shanti Sells and David Strauss for illegal transportation of undocumented migrants. We have got to scratch our heads when we hear of that, to wonder, is that what this is about? Is that the immigration policy that we so fiercely want to enforce? The voices that I've heard, that I've been privileged to hear over the last 30-some-odd years that I've been involved in immigration rights, are voices of people that I grew up with. I grew up in a small Mexican-American town in central Arizona called Superior, Arizona, a copper mining town. Probably about 5,000 people in the town. Today, more than half are Mexican. My family was the only Chinese-American family in the community. And I was talking to somebody earlier, I think it was President Sorensen, that my mother was the first person to teach me both Cantonese and Spanish, because our customers in the grocery store were mostly Mexican Spanish speakers, and so my mother was actually trilingual. And so it's not unusual for me to feel some affinity toward the Mexican-American community, because, to be honest with you, they sent me to college. They were our customers. All of our kids, all of my siblings went to school, and we were lucky enough to go to college. And I dragged my family back to Superior, Arizona a couple times a year, and we get together with my old high school friends. So when I hear about the estimated 12 million, some people estimate as many as 15 million undocumented in the United States, you first have to ask yourselves, well, what are they doing here and why? And I think the theme of this session is the answer, because to understand globalization is to understand migration. And so I'm going to come back to that in a minute as I've given you the tease. But as I said, I've had the opportunity to meet and talk with many people. I've been on the road all this week, to be honest with you. I left Monday morning from San Francisco, headed to Des Moines, Iowa. And in Des Moines, it was the third of 5 hearings that I'm involved with a union that's investigating the effect of ICE raids, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, what many people used to call INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service. The voices that you hear of the people that have been victims of these ICE raids is just unbelievable. Mothers separated from children whom they're nursing for not just days, but weeks and months. American citizens, I dare say people that look like John Lindner, who came before us to testify about how, because they also worked at the Swift packing house, that they were detained for 6 to 8 hours, and they also could not go to the bathroom. They also could not call their friends and relatives or attorneys. But just because they worked at the same plant where there were undocumented workers, they also were treated the same way. That was some of the most powerful testimony that we heard on Tuesday in Des Moines, was the quote-unquote regular Americans who were outraged at what had happened, wondering if they were still living in America. So it really makes you wonder, especially when we know that the reason that undocumented workers are here is a reason that goes back to not just the history and tradition of that border that seems to be the focus of things, the cultural regularity of people coming and going, the fact that when we're in California, we always use the line, the border, people didn't move across the border moved on the people, because the border before 1848 was included Colorado, New Mexico, California, et cetera, Utah. But people still come and go. People still are recruited. And why are they recruited? Because it's something that President Bush recognizes, that President Bush recognized several years ago when he recommended a guest worker program, that he is convinced that because of the way the economy works and the way that many of us baby boomers are going to be retiring soon, that in fact we need more immigrant workers in the United States, because we're running out of workers if we want the Social Security system to be viable. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So we have to understand that there would not be an undocumented immigration problem if we actually approach this from a sensible way and understood that what we need are more visas to accommodate these folks that are coming in. A number of issues that I scratch my head about are things that I want to mention very briefly. And let me start with the most difficult one, and that's deportation of criminals. The other way I get to vicariously help immigrants today in a direct way is that one of the clinics that we have at the law school at Davis is an immigration clinic, and it's one of the only immigration clinics in the country that specializes in representing lawful immigrants who have been convicted of aggravated felonies. Some of the crimes that have been committed are terrible, and I certainly don't defend those actions, and I think those people who have committed crimes should go to jail, but in fact they all have. Every one of the people that I'm talking about are people that pretty much grew up in the United States. They came in legally, and for the reasons that any of you who have looked into criminal justice and criminality in the United States understand that we've failed as a country in many respects, and one is with respect to how to deal with families who are in trouble in inner cities and in rural parts of the country, and so kids join gangs, kids commit crimes, kids go to jail, but American citizen kids get out of jail and hopefully straighten out. Immigrant kids get out of jail and get deported. And what strikes me about this, especially since about 6 years ago we started deporting Cambodians, people that had entered as infants and toddlers legally as refugees from Thai refugee camps that were, as part of our failed resettlement policies, placed families in inner cities and public housing, and were placed in situations where to fend for themselves, some of them, not all of them of course, join gangs, and they get convicted of crimes. And up until 6 years ago, we didn't deport people from communist-dominated countries. We still don't deport people to Cuba who are convicted of serious crimes. But for some reason, we thought we could pick on Cambodia. And in fact, we did, and we strong-armed Cambodia into signing a memorandum of understanding. And so we've now deported close to 200 people to Cambodia who grew up here, who can't speak Khmer, who are sent back and don't have any resources, and their lives are basically lost. And some of you know that probably 6 or 8 weeks ago, a similar agreement was signed with Vietnam. And so we're going to begin deporting Vietnamese who came as youngsters and have committed crimes. And I guess that's one way of solving our criminal problem, is deporting those young adults who grew up here and committed their crimes in the United States, and we're going to deport that problem back to Southeast Asia. What I wonder about and scratch my head about is, why don't we provide some relief? Why can't we have a hearing, which we no longer do? We did prior to 1996. But after 1996, one of the immigration laws that was enacted at that time removed the discretion for immigration judges to grant discretionary, not absolute, discretionary relief to somebody who had committed a crime after living here legally for many years. If that person was rehabilitated, remorseful, had family here, there was evidence of getting on the right track, an immigration judge could, in his or her discretion, grant discretionary relief to let the person stay here. And if that person, one false move, and that person ever came back before that judge, that person was out of here. And I am not exaggerating. In the years that I practiced, through clinics and with private attorneys who were doing pro bono work, I probably represented about 70 people in those types of hearings. And of that 70, not one of them ever recidivated. Not one of them. They were scared. I don't want to use profanity here. They were very scared, and they never committed another crime, because they definitely got the message. They were scared straight. So I scratch my head and wonder why we can't re-implement that discretionary relief. The other issue came up last summer, and that's this continuous attack on family immigration that I've been battling since the early 1980s, and I thought, even though it recurred over and over again until around 1995 or so, that issue went away. And this is what I mean. Most immigration today, as Dr. Fraga indicated this morning, is from Latin America and Asia, and the immigration structure is mostly family-based. The non-refugee categories for entering the country is primarily family-based. But somewhere along the line, certain people have decided we shouldn't have family-based immigration. And you might not have been able to get that from the coverage this summer of the immigration debate. But part of that immigration debate, of course, was about whether or not we should legalize the undocumented. But a small part that hardly got any coverage was replacing the family immigration system with a point-based immigration system, where instead of whether or not you had a relative here, the question was, do you have an advanced degree, do you speak English, et cetera, et cetera. And what personally I'm troubled with about that, because personally so many of my own relatives and clients have benefited from the family categories, is that the implication is that family immigrants are deadbeats somehow, that they come here and they don't contribute to the society, whereas in fact, most of the people in this country, they came here because of family, and most of the immigrants who came to this country are productive, contributing members of society. And so I must say that I should be thanking you, because the coalitions that have been primarily supportive of the family immigration systems that have helped to save, for example, the sibling category, which is the category that's most attacked, that somehow our brothers and sisters aren't part of our nuclear family and that we shouldn't care as much about them. That's actually been stated on the floor of the House and the Senate. It's been the church groups, it's been coalitions of churches that have actually helped to stave off that attack. And unfortunately, I want to tell you that just 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with one of my immigrant rights friends in Washington, D.C., one of probably a handful of folks that are known as the best known immigrant rights advocates and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. One of them told me, Bill, you're going to lose the family categories this year, or when immigration comes back up again. I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, the deals are all being made right now. The family stuff is going to be eliminated if you want legalization for undocumented. And it's been presented as a fait accompli. It's unbelievable. And, of course, I'm not going to stand for that personally. Whether or not other people stand with me is another question. But that's the way the talk goes in Washington. I don't need to tell you all that these deals are being made already, and whoever becomes the president, that's what's going to be presented to the new president, a done deal in terms of, some path to legalization, but get rid of the family categories. And George Rupp alluded to this earlier, and we are a land of immigrants, but we are a land that loves to debate immigration policy, and we waste so much time debating immigration policy when, in fact, what we should be doing is spending our time on an integration policy. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't take much to understand what the difference would be in communities that were more receptive toward immigrants, what attitude change can do to the health and well-being of communities. And let me give you an example. There's a woman in North Carolina, Millie Ravenel, who runs a program at the University of North Carolina called the Latino Initiative. And a few years ago, she, for the longest time, before the demographic changes in throughout the South that we're all aware of, it was mostly about black-white conflict. But when the demographic changes began occurring in terms of Latin immigration, they developed a separate Latino initiative. They're a local county commissioner named Rick Givens. And you can Google his name, and you'll see these wonderful stories about Rick. He thought he was doing his job, and he wrote a letter to the local immigration authorities saying, do your job and round up these undocumented immigrants because they're taking jobs away, sort of the well-worn complaint. And so Millie thought, we've got to promote some understanding here. And so what she did was she raised funds for this initiative, and she invited local public school teachers and local government officials to go with her to Mexico to, let's find out. Let's find out where these people are from and what their values are and why they're here. And so Rick Givens was one of the guys she invited, and you can probably guess from the expression on my face what the end of the story is. Rick Givens went, and he, after 3 weeks of living with a Mexican family in Michoacan, he came back and he retracted his letter, and he said, we got to do this a different way because I've found that these folks are like my grandparents who came from Ireland. And so there's been a change in attitude among certain sectors of Siler City, North Carolina, and you have these small initiatives on integration that make sense, and I believe that that's what one of our calls should be. Our calls should be for conversation and community building, beginning in our own neighborhoods, with respect to who are the people among us, and why are they here, and what are their values, and what do they think, and I think that we would all be pleased by what we hear from those individuals. So, to me, understanding globalization helps us understand migration because it understands why people move. And I want to close in a bit because I know we want to get to your comments and questions. I must say that although I'm supporting one of them, that I'm disappointed in the descriptions that all three of the final presidential candidates have of NAFTA, for example, and that they, well, at least two of them, talk about how NAFTA has hurt the American public, the American worker. And that's kind of the end of the discussion of NAFTA. But the truth is that NAFTA has really hurt Mexico. And I wish people would understand that. Mexico got a raw deal from NAFTA. We thought then that was what was sold to us on NAFTA, that, we were going to resolve Mexican migration also because through trade all this development would occur in Mexico and all these jobs would occur. So we didn't need to provide a labor migration provision in NAFTA, it was said. But what happened after NAFTA is that, I would have, tomatoes would have been thrown at me in Des Moines if I had said this a couple of days ago in Des Moines, I think. But because of farm subsidies that continue in the United States to American farmers, but that disappeared after 1994 in Mexico, as unbelievable as it may sound, Mexicans now import their corn from the United States. They don't grow their corn anymore. Where do those Mexican farmers go? Well, first they go to the city of Mexico City, and then they come to the United States. Then the other trade, quote-unquote, deal was January 2005, when the International Microfibers Agreement expired. And up until that time, countries could not send unlimited number of goods to other countries. But after that expired in January 2005, and many of you can go home and look at where your clothes are made. I would venture to guess that a lot of it's made in China. Well, believe it or not, because China can flood our markets now with their goods. There are businesses closing in Mexico because they cannot compete with China. We've got to understand that the European Union has it right and we have it wrong in terms of how they handle globalization. Your EU was very concerned about people from poor new members coming in, that they thought they were going to experience this flood of people from going back to Ireland, Spain, etc. And so what did the EU do? Well, the EU decided, well, we understand we've actually got to do something to compete with the United States. That's why we need the EU. But if we're going to have open labor migration, which they do have, we're going to help our poor countries too. So they invested billions of dollars in the infrastructures of those countries. And after those poorer countries entered, during periods of time when they received these adhesion funds, you have not seen any of that happen. You've not seen poor countries. In fact, Spain and Ireland, for the first time in their histories, have become immigrant-receiving nations. They're no longer immigrant nations. It's amazing. And so, we have, we don't have all the answers as Americans. I think there are other places where we can learn from. In a strange way, September 11th reminded us of the diversity of the United States, because we looked around and we saw all the people that died in the Twin Towers, and they were from all over the world. We realized that we are a nation of immigrants. I was so proud of President Bush and the Attorney General at that time. They got on a stage with a very diverse group of people saying, these are all Americans, and we're in this together. America had a wonderful opportunity at that time to do something very strong and positive to bring people of the world together. It's too bad that shortly after that, the Patriot Act was enforced, and we saw a different side of America. And I'll leave it to you to judge whether or not we've blown that opportunity that was presented to us shortly after September 11th. But I will say this, that we do have a choice of America. We have a choice of America that can be very open and understanding of the experiment that we call America, or we can choose to be closed and continue to look at America in a very narrow manner that puts us outside the circle of where globalization is going. Thank you very much.
At this point, the floor is open for questions, comments, concerns. Tom, and if we could get you a mic.
These have been extraordinary presentations from my point of view, and I think we're greatly indebted to you. And what impresses me is that we have the distinction between refugees, where we normally talk about fleeing violence. Naturally, the word can be ambiguous, because if you're starving, doesn't that qualify as well? So may it not be economic situations, but we also have had attention to the way a global market economy is impacting economic development differently in different parts of the world. In fact, I especially appreciated your comment about NAFTA, because the reason so many people from Mexico are trying to get into the U.S., even illegally, is because we made agreements that undermine their ability to support themselves in Mexico. But at the same time, I do agree that with our Democratic candidates that NAFTA, the farm subsidies, for example, mainly go to industrial farms. Mm-hmm. This is farming for export. Now, what I would welcome is how you, it appears to me what's so overwhelming about this is that we have economic dimensions and we have peace and stability, peacemaking challenges, and I'd be interested in, and yet I think they're connected. That is, I think many areas of the world experience violence because of economic factors. But I would be interested in hearing some comment on how we analyze these different problems and yet see that they're related as we think about our tasks.
Well, I'd like to just pick up where Bill left off, because it seems to me the examples of Ireland and Spain are really just have to get our attention. These are, take just Ireland, which we all know well, anyone in New England knows well, a huge exporter of people for generation after generation, that now has become, because there was an investment in the infrastructure, has become an importer of talent and provides good jobs for people from other parts of the world, certainly other parts of Europe. I think that the connections between the economic and the political are really very direct, and the reason that I applauded Harry's and John's decision to try to put the issue of immigration in a global context is because we have to make investments in the sending countries if the problems are going to be manageable. And Mexico is the clearest example for the U.S., but there's similar examples in every other of the countries where the IRC works, where because of our orientation to emergencies, we don't make investments until there's a conflict and there are large numbers of uprooted people who are fleeing for their lives. much more modest investments over a long period of time, but not as modest as what we've been making. I mean, more significant investments than we've been making, but over a long period of time, could make people do what they really want to do. They'd like to stay home. They'd like to be able to support themselves in their own countries. But we have managed to develop a world organization in which the pressures of globalization make it increasingly difficult for people who want to stay home. So first they go to cities because they can't support themselves on the land anymore. And then when they can't find anything to do in cities, they, one way or another, find their way to other countries. So we cannot solve the immigration problem unless we solve the economic problems in the sending countries. And I think in different ways we really all said that.
No, I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
Brenda?
I think I can talk about it.
No, you can't.
You're not allowed because it's being taped and you have to be recorded.
Oh, right. Well, this may be a similar type of question, but I wondered if anybody was putting forth the idea of a common American home that would be like Central America through Mexico. I mean, in other words, to do what Europe did, and to form a union that would look at a common economy. And then the second, who is analyzing failed states or a collapsed state, a la Jared Diamond? What do we do about those situations that are just so complex and we would call the situation a failed state, and that it's just going to keep on killing people and so forth?
Well, I am aware of a couple of authors that are writing along those terms. Robert, Faux, F-A-U-X, and Robert Pastor, P-A-S-T-O-R, who have written books promoting a more EU type of regional effort. But you have to distinguish between a real integrated system that recognizes labor migration and investments in the sort of one market along the EU lines. You have to distinguish that between individualized free trade agreements that this administration has taken, which it's not about the workers, it's more about opportunities for the investors and the corporations, to be honest with you, who will look for anywhere for free labor. And I'm saying it in a pejorative way, and I don't mean to say it that pejoratively, but who benefits from the way current free trade agreements are arranged that the United States has engaged in are the corporations, not the workers. The argument is that we as consumers benefit because then we get lower priced goods. But I wonder if that's what, if we had the choice, between low-priced goods, cheap goods, versus a stable region where people are happy working where they live and they grew up, and I think Americans would choose that because I don't think we support free trade because of cheap goods. We support it for other beliefs, I think.
Here?
Well, could I?
Yeah, sure.
I want. Well, two comments, Brenda. First, the world cannot afford failed states. I don't mean there aren't any. And in fact, the International Rescue Committee is involved in virtually all of the states that would qualify as that. But it's simply it is an unaffordable burden. It is far cheaper to get states functional than to try to tolerate or afford failed states, because they will just generate endless, not only endless deaths, but also endless exported people that will come to the rest of the world. Even very large countries, Congo and Sudan, two extraordinarily, the two largest countries in Africa, we make minuscule investments. And then we say, gee, well, it doesn't seem to be getting us anything. I mean, the investment of the entire developed world in Congo is about $5 per person per year. And then we're surprised it doesn't transform Congo. So we do have to be realistic about what it takes in order to pull a failed state out of the ditch. But to take any comfort in the fact that there's some states that are just failed and they'll never get better. We're creating a failed state in Palestine as we watch, and we can just observe how many generations will pay for the fact that we are somehow going to tolerate a failed state. So I feel very strongly that we can't be casual about assuming that any state is incorrigibly failed. They need to be rescued. Yeah. And maybe just
to say that maybe just for failed state, that this is the role of the United Nations also. And that's why we are working in countries for development, but particularly post-conflict. You know, we are there before the conflict, but also during the conflict and after the conflict. And particularly to work on good governance. We have many agencies of the UN, for example, UNDP, which is the United Nations for Development. Their specialty is to work with governments for good governance. We have succeeded. In Sierra Leone, for example, we have success, we can say. In Liberia, until now, we have success, and we hope that we will have success in Africa.
I just wanted to backtrack for 1 second, because Tom's question also included the little jab at agricultural subsidies, and I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to say I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is an example where U.S.-based policy has catastrophic effects for the rest of the world and benefits only a very, very small slice of the American population. So we give $25 million a year in cotton subsidies, just to take one specific example. It benefits several handful of agribusinesses. I mean, that already are. President Bush, to his credit, wanted to establish a ceiling that you had to earn less than $200,000, and the total subsidy had to be no less than $250,000. So I mean, it would stop being a subsidy once people got to $450,000. That was unacceptable to farm state legislatures. So we now have an agricultural subsidy that is targeted on a very small number of cotton growers in the U.S. who frankly wouldn't be able to grow cotton without the subsidy. But they're putting out of business cotton farmers in West Africa who would be able to export competitively into the world market and would be able at least to have their own cotton rather than in just the way the Mexicans are importing rice, importing our corn. West Africa imports cotton that is inferior in quality and would be higher in price, except that we have these subsidies that benefit almost nobody in this country. Now, that's a policy that our political system really has a great deal of difficulty dealing with that, but the religious community has to call that kind of policy what it is. Namely, it is absolutely diabolical in terms of its total impact on the world, and in this case, putting hardworking West African farmers out of business, who then go to the cities, and when they can't find work there, wind up coming as immigrants, illegal or legal, to the United States. Sorry, there were other
or
questions.
France or Spain or Europe.
Yeah, that's right. After West Africa,
Let's
they're
take a
more
question here first, and then...
Thank you very much for your presentations and for the work that you're doing to benefit many people. And I just want to comment after I'll make a couple of questions in reference to globalization. So I feel it's a term that we follow the dictionary, but it seems like it's not representative. And I understand that the comments that you three of you made do not really show globalization as we see that there are many situations that really prevent it from being a true globalization. And the question for policy that I bring up, and I tend to think that things happen because somebody planned them and really worked hard at them for a long time, and coming from the corporate world somehow, I believe that happens. And one of them is...
You don't believe it's God working through the invisible hand?
Yes, and making his presence needed through what we do as humans. So in that way I do. And one of them is workers as commodities. It seems to me that that's the new slavery of today, and it seems to me that governments sending population and receiving population, there's something of agreements going on there to make it a reality. And President Bush's recent proposal of modifying certain things of a permit might be in that source. And the other one is the deterrence that you mentioned that happens in the borders. But I will talk about attrition. It seems to me that that's happening in the United States. It's a way of expulsion of people through deterrence within society by keeping them away from being happy, being comfortable, or realizing their goals. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, let me give one stab at both those points. One, your latter point on deterrence, it's symbolized by what's happened over the last year and a half in terms of the local ordinances, local and state ordinances that are trying to make immigrants' lives miserable in the United States and deter them. And apparently it's having some effect, as you're alluding to, that there are some people moving out of certain areas because they don't feel welcome. I've seen the flip side of that, where in these ICE raid investigations that I'm helping out with, where communities are very upset at ICE removing immigrants, hardworking immigrants from their
ICE
communities.
is the old INS.
Right, INS. Right. Because not only do they not like the way it's happening, but because they're taking away residents that are working members, consumers of the community, and some of these small towns are dying. Immigrants have lived. Still more joke was the name of one of the towns where there's a lot of people over that. On your first point, I do want to comment on President Bush's proposal, which I might have left that I'm in favor of, and I'm not in favor of it. And let me tell you why. I'm in favor of more visas. I'm not in favor of a system that's supposed to be exploited. I believe a system guest worker that stay here 3 years, past 6 years, and then you're here. There's I think it recognizes dignity with those people work. I think that most people, in fact, do want to go back home. Okay, a lot of people understand that. But let them have a choice. What's wrong with a type of visa where they can come here and make sure that they have their rights respected, and give them the choice at some period. Do you want to stay here permanently or not? And I don't think all of them will. I think that many of them want to go back home. I'm not in favor of open borders either, don't understand me, because I think that's a bad idea for Mexico. For many of the reasons that George alluded to as well. It would be awful for Mexico to be rid of all its able-bodied workers. I mean, Mexico needs it's a version of brain drain, and I would be afraid of that. That's why I'm much more for helping figure out a way that Mexico can be successful. I think if Mexico is successful, we can be successful.
Just on the guest workers, this is, again, it seems to me a case where we simply are unwilling to learn from the experience of other countries. Germany, in particular, has had generations of experience with guest workers. It's generation of experience because the first guest workers are still in Germany. But they're not allowed really to be integrated into the society. So you have Turks and Greeks primarily. Turks more than Greeks by now, because many Greeks finally did go back home. But they came as guest workers. They weren't given a path to becoming full German citizens. Even their children don't have children who grow up speaking German, who don't speak Turkish or speak very bad Turkish, are basically between two countries. And the idea that we're going to invent a guest worker program that circumvents all of the difficulties that all the other guest worker programs have had seems to me extremely unlikely. And therefore, I do think we have to have a way of allowing workers who have, it's not open borders, they have to get visas, but aren't foreclosed from the possibility of becoming full members of American society at some point.
Hello. I wanted to first thank you all for your wonderful presentations and invite your comments on a couple observations. One is that those of us looking for a more humane immigration reform commonly talk about this as a nation of immigrants. And to me, this is an insufficient way of advocating for change, because it's a failure to recognize that actually this is a country that was founded and promoted a system of labor and an economy that created pools of workers precluded from rights of naturalization and full citizenship, that this is a continual pattern of exclusion and removal of populations in the process of formation. It's much more a settler colonial system, and the case of Mexico, the case of Asian workers, the case of blacks, that this is a state founded on the ability to segregate categories of citizens from non-citizens in its maintenance of a workforce. And so it seems to me that part of what we're seeing now in the post-9/11 is perhaps a more virulent and far-reaching acceleration of forms of exclusion and racialization, but racialization has been a part of immigration policy from the beginning, both in refugee and regular immigration policy. The second observation is that we're talking about humanitarian aid and foreign investment on the U.S. as a way of promoting global equality that might address the needs of sending nations. But one of the things that we also need to be attentive to is how much aid the U.S. is actually exporting in the form of military aid, in the form of repressive policy to control movement of populations before they reach the U.S.-Mexican border, before they reach the oceans coming from into the U.S. through the Pacific. And so the U.S. is currently under the auspices of Plan Mexico, but other plans as well, investing in forms of military assistance that are aimed at preventing crossing, particularly from Central America into the U.S., in ways that promotes anti-democratic, non-democratic, and highly repressive action by our partners within the Americas and around the world. Not only through our policy of extraordinary rendition are we promoting the erosion of human rights standards, but also through the deportation of immigrants who are penalized once again as they return to their home country. So I just wanted to make that observation that in fact we are sending enormous amounts of money, but with the purpose of absolving us of the problem of absorbing that population in its movement.
Right. No, well, just one comment, El Salvador and Guatemala did not have as serious a gang problem until we started deporting their gang members back, who grew up in the United States.
Well, I guess I would, I agree with your observations, so don't take my comment as disagreeing with the basic premise. But I also think that as much as it's important for us to recognize that cavalier talk about the U.S. as a nation of immigrants is a kind of whitewashing of very nefarious dimensions of our history. I agree completely with that. Native Americans, obviously an egregious instance, blacks, the way Japanese were treated in World War II, and many other examples. So I don't want to disagree, but it does seem to me there's a basic trajectory that the U.S. can at least aspire to that does go back very far. I mean, the Pilgrims, after all, were refugees, so, and that doesn't mean they didn't do awful things in the course of our history as they displaced Native Americans and the rest. And I think, as I tried to indicate toward the end of my comments, that the U.S. can transcend its racialist and exclusionary past. I don't mean perfectly, but there's a thrust in that direction that I think needs to be nurtured and encouraged, even as we point out the ways in which we've had deficiencies. And our deficiencies are actually not worse than those of many other countries. It's just that we're self-righteous about them, which is what irritates many of us, but certainly many people in other parts of the world, as if we have no deficiencies. But it doesn't change the fact that we have assets in our history that allow us to have a more positive trajectory than your observations would note. And I think we ought to celebrate those, even though they're imperfect and partial. Because if we don't, then those positive lessons that we have learned painfully ourselves and could teach the rest of the world will be lost. And the fact is, we have been more able to incorporate newcomers than many other countries. Not perfectly, but in many other countries. And the examples I would use would be the Turks in Germany or the Koreans in Japan. But you could use many other examples. And so without claiming more than is just defensible, we ought to at least recognize what's positive in that somewhat sordid history rather than just write it all off. And as people who know me well, it is very rare that I make something that will be that close to a pro-American statement. But
And maybe permit me to say, becoming also working in different countries, that you can be a model for other countries. And I've been working in many countries where I see organizations from the United States that can help, and they are helping. They are everywhere. So civil society is very strong, and the organizations are very strong. So I think you should continue to advocate, and you are a model for other countries.
Steve?
I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you refer to as assets, particularly with respect to the history of immigration policy over the last 120 years as waves of Swedes and Chinese and Irish came over and immigration policy contracted and expanded. And are there aspects of that history that may have been forgotten or may provide some guidance forward?
Well, I don't think I could say more than I just said. I think there are aspects to that history that are admirable and that provide guidance going forward. But that shouldn't lead us to overlook the ways in which there were also some real negative undertones of it.
It took, I should count, let's see, it was, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson. It took 4 presidents to, and their leadership, to end the national origins quota system, which had been part of the law in the 1920s that was, frankly, it was very racist in model against not just Asians, but also Southern and Eastern Europeans, right? And it was Harry Truman who first vetoed the 1952 Immigration Act, embarrassed that the country didn't amend the national origin quota system. Dwight Eisenhower advocated for the same thing. John Kennedy wrote a book, The Nation of Immigrants, in which he chastised the country for the national origin quota system, and he introduced the legislation that became the 1965 Act, and Lyndon Johnson helped to push it through as part of his civil rights agenda. So I guess, unfortunately, that lesson is that it takes time, but it takes the bully pulpit, too. And in the scheme of things, maybe it wasn't that long, but it took time. And I must say also that on a day-to-day level, and this is what I think you're alluding to, Rima, that there are individual victories, and I'm not talking about individual cases, but at local levels where negotiating with the local ICE officials or the UCIS officials, which are the visa issuing people, on how operations are done, even how raids are done. Like, there are local victories where small changes are made, and that's really important to the people in those communities. Okay?
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about different theologies of citizenship. It seems to me that one of the limitations post 9/11 is that our formulations of citizenship have been primarily judicial, institutional, while we know that in part, in echo of what Professor Camacho was talking about, is that many of the ways that citizenship have been reformulated in the United States, and even in the last 50, 60 years have been the result of church movements. That is, expansive notions of citizenship in the civil rights movement in the 60s, the work that Catholic nuns did in the internment camps in California. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about different theologies that we might use, say, the sanctuary movement, Jewish notions of belonging and exile, to reformulate who counts as a citizen, what it means to be an American, rather than relying, again, on the state, which I think, as Professor Camacho indicated, its notions of sovereignty and political economy are probably not going to get us where we'd like to go in terms of the humane treatment of immigrants.
We're looking for you, George.
I guess I find thinking about theologies of citizenship, I don't quite think in those categories, but let me try to be responsive to I think the concern behind the question is. I think there are huge resources in religious traditions, and not just Christian ones, as you implied, also certainly in Jewish and Muslim, but in Hindu and Buddhist and other traditions about which I know. There are enormous resources for welcoming the stranger, for hospitality, for being generous to aliens. And I think all of those traditions can and should be invoked and I assume that in tomorrow's discussion, where there's more of a focus on the religious dimension of all of this, they will be invoked. And I think you mentioned important examples. Some of the civil rights, the driving force of the early civil rights movement was clearly religious in many respects. The extent to which Roman Catholic nuns were involved in California with respect to the internment camps, I think is a good, often forgotten story. And there are many others, and so I would celebrate those and press them. I guess I don't think of them as theologies of citizenship, and I just have to try to figure out just what that seems to me a little bit as a crossing of categories. I mean, it seems to me that the religious, I wouldn't just say the theological, the religious impulse is to show hospitality to the stranger. I put it in Christian terms. In the church, there's neither Greek nor Jew, male nor female, slave nor free, and that certainly means neither, exile outsider versus insider. And I think all those religious impulses are powerful, ought to be enlisted, but they have to do with welcoming people at the most basic human level. I have to think about this, but I don't think it's helpful to transpose that into citizenship, which is a political, juridical, legal, public issue. I don't mean it's separate from the other, but it doesn't seem to me quite the same thing. Because if we make it the same, then the kind of critical edge that religious imagery and symbolism can exercise over against whatever notion of citizenship there is has been collapsed, and then somehow welcoming people into citizenship takes care of it, which it doesn't. I mean, that's just a kind of a very low threshold starting. It's better that we do that than we treat people the way Bill described rightly, that we treat people when we export our souls. But it's I wouldn't think of it as I wouldn't mix the theological with the citizenship category.
Yeah, the way I look at it, although I'd be happy to talk with you more about how you would set it out in terms of theological terms. The way I look at it is more who we welcome as a member or who we regard as potentially an American. Because, and it's partly what I was ending on a second ago, it's the message and the attitude that we have toward people who are different. I mean, let's face it, many of us, my family included, were conditioned to not like certain people, and that's a shame. So anytime we rise above that and reach out to somebody that we may have been conditioned to hate and to not respect, we've made great strides, I think, and that's what we ought to be promoting. I've used a term to describe the opposite. You know, when I think of people who engage in hate speech or hate crimes, they send a message of de-Americanization. They're de-Americanizing somebody. They're telling people that they don't belong. After September 11th, a synagogue outside of, not a synagogue, a mosque outside of Chicago, it was like an Olympic rally. There were people with not billboards, what do you call these? Posters marching around the mosque, chanting, USA, USA, you should go home, to the people that were inside the mosque. They were sending this message, you're not American. And so that's the way I look at it, is that it's this tension, it's this debate over who we decide is potentially one of us. And to me, that's membership. And maybe that's what you mean by citizenship as well.
Just to talk maybe about hate messages, not only in the United States, but you know that hate messages cause genocides in Rwanda and other countries. And that's why the media also is very, very important. For example, I was in Ivory Coast when there were hate messages against Muslims of the North. There was a war between the North and the South. So the first thing was to do is to call the Secretary General so that he calls the President of the country to say that, you know, hate messages should be stopped because they can cause war and conflict and killing people. Maybe they did not cause it here, but it caused it in other countries. So the role of the media is very important.
I have a question over here.
I just wanted to ask Dr. Hing if you could elaborate a little bit on...
It's not doctor, but thanks.
Okay.
I don't want to commit a fraud here.
Sure, it's doctor, right?
That's true.
So if you could elaborate a little bit on what you were saying about these deals that are being cut in the Congress in terms of future immigration policy, because I think there was some hope that there would be some real conversation about that. Some of our denominations have representatives in Washington.
Oh, yeah. No,
and I just wonder, are they part of the network that would be aware of that? Are you involved? What do we do about that? Because if we're going to wake up after the elections and find out this thing has already been decided, that's going to be a mess.
At the risk of sounding less than humble, I'm used. These people point to me as the outlier, and they say, if you don't. They say to members of Congress, if you don't go along with this, you know, these crazy people like Bill Hing are going to be on you, et cetera, et cetera. We're trying to fend off the crazy people in California. It's not the people from U.S. Catholic Conference. It is people at the National Immigration Forum, at National Council of Raza. Some of these names are going to surprise you. At the Asian American Justice Center, that are working on these deals with members of Congress in the Democratic Party, because they're anticipating that there's going to be a Democratic president, although if that doesn't happen, it's going to be worse. And they've got bills drafted already. And
that does that include the religious groups?
No,
okay.
It doesn't. But they're not being invited. The religious groups are not being invited. They're not part of the insiders on this.
They're not thwarting it, though.
They're not.
No, they're not the ones that are setting you up.
No.
Okay.
Right.
Do you work with them at all, with the religious groups?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
One last question, Carol.
Just related to what you were saying, Dr. Hing. Last summer, I was in a seminar at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico with a young pastor who was the founder of the Border Links Ministry, and this is a project of the Presbyterian Church and cooperating denominations. And they're doing what your two young people were doing, just trying to save lives. So, I think theology is always basic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I think this is a good point to say thank you to the three panelists of this afternoon, George Rupp, Salah,